Easter this year is going to be a little bit different than most. For one thing, it would be completely acceptable for you to wear your pajamas to church on Easter morning. Even though we won't be gathering in person on Easter Sunday, there's still a sense of joyous expectation that marks the day. This year, that joy will be tempered a little bit by our current situation, but it'll be there nonetheless. Easter is a collage of different celebrations. Even outside of the religious celebrations at churches, society also marks the day as a cause for celebration. We have the Easter bunny, egg hunts, and chocolate as far as the eye can see. And each family has their own litany of different traditions for Easter, as with any other major holiday. My family would all get together at my aunt's house. We'd have a nice ham dinner with all the sides that you would expect. And after dinner, my cousins, who were a few years younger than my brother Doug and I, would take part in an egg hunt. When Doug and I were old enough, we were tasked with the responsibility of hiding the eggs out in the yard. Once, Easter was a little bit earlier in the year, and there was still a layer of fresh snow on the ground. My grandma joined Doug and I as we got ready to go out to hide the eggs. And as we got ready, we realized that the snow was going to be a problem. See, if we went out to hide the eggs, we'd leave footprints all around the yard that would lead the kids right to the eggs. My grandma, being the schemer that she was, looked at us and said, "What if we didn't hide any eggs?" So we tossed the bags of eggs in a closet, took off our boots, and went back to tell the kids that the egg hunt was ready. The kids went out and searched in the yard for quite a while. They searched and searched, growing more and more frustrated as their bags remained empty. Eventually, they gave up, and we let them in on the secret. We thought that it was hilarious, and they may have even forgiven us by now. Easter is a time that brings families together, and it is a joyful season. There's also the celebration at church that Sunday morning, or out in the wild if you're one of those kinds of people who likes getting up for the sunrise service. Easter is one of the two high points of the church year, the other, of course, being Christmas. They're both these great moments in the story of the life of Jesus that give us cause for joyous celebration. The birth of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. And we rightly celebrate both of these moments as fundamental to our faith. The Messiah who lived and the Messiah who lives again. But in the context of the church year, they're more than two dates marked on a calendar for celebration. See, the church year is a cycle. There's a season of expectation and anticipation, Advent and Lent, that leads up to one of the two high points of the year, Christmas and Easter. And then each of those has a season of varying lengths, which leads to another slightly more minor holiday, Epiphany and Pentecost. And after those holidays, before the next season of anticipation is what we call ordinary time, or the season of the church. And then the cycle begins all over again. We build up a sense of anticipation to a holy day, and then slowly come back down to ordinary time. In Lent, we feel this expectation through fasting. We give up chocolate and meat on Fridays, and this year we gave up just about everything. This sense of loss through fasting builds in us a sense of anticipation of when that thing will be restored. This practice helps us to prepare for the restoration of life on Easter morning. But somewhat unlike Christmas, Easter has a second level of preparation before the big day. We call it Holy Week. It starts with Palm Sunday, and then skips ahead a few days to the Thursday before Easter, with Maundy Thursday, and then Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and then finally Easter Sunday. Each of these days represents a different event in the last week of Jesus' life. As we think about the Easter celebration, we have to be careful not to skip over the events of Holy Week. The joy of Easter Sunday is in response to the darkness of Good Friday. There are a lot of places where you could start the story of Good Friday. You could go all the way back to the beginning in Bethlehem, or the entrance into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, or just about anywhere in between. I guess we can start the story here. The story of Good Friday has a lot to do with the story of Israel. At the beginning of Matthew chapter 26, we're told that the chief priests and the elders of the people in Jerusalem gathered at the high priest Caiaphas' house. The purpose of this meeting was that they were planning how they could arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. We often think of the chief priests and the elders as the villains of the gospel stories. It is true that many of the stories in the four Gospels involve Jesus having some sort of argument with the priests, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. But we can't forget one important thing. They were Jesus's people. Much of the biblical story has to do with the Israelite people and their journey to becoming a nation, and then their return to being a nation later on after the exile. And at the same time, this common thread that ran through the story was that they were God's chosen people. The people who call Israel as their ancestors, the Jewish people, of which the chief priests, elders, disciples, and Jesus were all a part. They were all one people who had a shared ancestry. Of course, in Jesus' case, it's a little more complicated because he was also fully divine. But in the fullness of his humanity, he was a Jewish man. But it was some of his own people, those people who he shared an ancestry with, were the ones plotting to kill him. On the eve of celebrating Passover, the holiday that reminds the Jewish people of their liberation from Egypt, some of them were plotting how to kill one of their own. The story of Good Friday begins with the betrayal of Jesus by those he could have called kin or neighbor or family. When we celebrate communion, one of the common practices is to take the bread and dip it into the cup and then eat it. That practice is called intinction. And the ritual of communion was founded in a scene that we referred to as the Last Supper. And that supper was actually a Passover meal, which is this meal that Jesus is sharing with his disciples. And there are all of these rituals that go along with the meal. Jewish families carry on this tradition today, and that meal is called a Seder. There are readings in Hebrew from the Exodus story. There are songs and even a few fun parts for the kids. There's a moment in the ritual of the Passover meal where bitter herbs are dipped and then eaten. Nowadays, we use horseradish as the bitter herb, and it's put on a piece of matzah, which is kind of like a saltine cracker, and then it's dipped into this mixture called haroset, which is an apple dish that helps to take the edge off some of the bitterness, which if you grew your own horseradish, the bitterness can be pretty significant. The bitterness of the herbs is meant to be a reminder of the bitterness of the slavery that the Israelites experienced when they were in Egypt. As Jesus was eating the Passover meal with his friends, he looked at them and said, "One of you will betray me." Of course, they were shocked by this, aghast. They couldn't imagine a time when they would even consider betraying their rabbi, their friend. They all swore it was not them, saying, "Surely not I, Lord." Jesus says to them, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me." The bitterness of the Israelite slavery is reimagined as the bitterness of betrayal. Betrayal by a close friend. A New Testament professor, when I was at Roberts, was a man named Casey Davis, and several times I had to meet with him for various different things. And he always insisted on meeting over lunch or dinner. So we'd meet in the dining hall, and we'd eat a meal together. And here's why. There's a connection you have with someone when you share a meal with them. A sense of intimacy develops between the two. There's a bond between the people that grows as they eat together. So the betrayal of Jesus was not just by someone he knew, but by some of those he sat and ate with. By some of those he had come to know intimately, who dipped into the same bowl as him. And you're probably wondering, why did I say it that way? What do I mean he'll be betrayed by some of those? Wasn't it just Judas who betrayed him? Well, of course Judas did. Judas sold his friend and teacher to those who wanted to kill him. But think of the well-known Good Friday hymn, "Were You There?" Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they nailed him to a tree? If we asked that question of those who adamantly swore that they would never abandon Jesus, how many of them could answer, "Yes, I was there"? One? Jesus was betrayed by Judas and condemned to death for money, but Jesus went to that death alone because the rest of his friends, his brothers, left him too. Jesus, betrayed by his people and betrayed by his friends, was not immune to the pain of what lay ahead. And we're given this moment of intimate insight into the emotion of Jesus as he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus retreats to a quiet place with just his closest friends and says to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death." And he asks the disciples who were there to pray for him as he goes off by himself to pray. Instead, they take a nap. And while we're quick to criticize them for this, how often do we tell someone, "I'll pray for you," just for the conversation to end? So Jesus finds a place of solitude, and he falls down on his knees and he prays, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." Jesus knew that the road that lay ahead was one of intense pain and suffering. He would be beaten nearly to death, then hung on a cross until he died. The physical toll leading up to that moment of death is unimaginable. "Let this cup pass from me, yet not what I want, but what you want." Jesus, when he's alone a second time, prays, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." And this moment shows us the courage of Jesus and his immense love for humanity, that all of this was done for us. But we must not forget what that love cost. This cup that is for the forgiveness of sins came at a steep cost. While I am a lover and a collector of books, Melissa, my wife, feels the same way about plants. For every shelf in our house that's filled with books, there's a flower or a fern, cactus, and the cats quite often try to eat some of the plants. So we have to put them up on top of the bookshelf so that they can't get to them. And I've never been much of a gardener myself. When it comes to flower beds and vegetable gardens, I don't like all of the time that you have to spend pulling out all the weeds. And as much as I try to avoid gardening, I can't help but notice that gardens have a tendency to show up in several key points of the biblical story. If we think about all the way back in the beginning of Genesis, we read one of the creation accounts that takes place in a garden. In the midst of that garden lived the man and the woman whom God had created. He made the first human being by taking dust and shaping it into a person and then breathing the breath of life into them, and they lived. And they were put in the garden to care for the plants and the animals. But something wasn't good in God's creation. See, a human was not meant to be alone. So, to make a partner for that person, God takes a rib from the first one and he builds it up into another one. And then there was man, and there was woman, and it was good. And they had free reign of the whole garden to care for it and to make something even more beautiful out of it. And we know that this ideal arrangement didn't last too long. The woman, convinced by the serpent, ate from one of the trees in the garden that they were told not to. And then she passed that forbidden fruit to the man who was standing there with her, and he ate as well. And in that moment, everything changed. Their life that had been a perfect arrangement of intimacy between them and the Creator God was now torn apart by sin. Life would never be the same. Sin became an obstacle between humanity and God. And it's an obstacle of our own making. But God doesn't abandon humanity to death and sin. Instead, he works a way for there to be a redemption. And the story winds its way along until we find ourselves in the midst of another garden, with Jesus on his knees praying, "Your will be done." And there's a direct connection between the Garden of Eden and the Garden of Gethsemane. In one, we find the sin that needs removal, and in the other, we're confronted not only with the start of that removal, but also the cost. As the Garden of Gethsemane transitions to Golgotha, the place of the skull, we witness the first half of the story of humanity's redemption, the price paid for each of us. I think a fitting analogy at this point would be Mount St. Helens, the volcano in Washington State. I went there when I was really young. When the volcano erupted, the surrounding area was completely devastated. All the trees were burned up and blown down, and the landscape was blackened from the explosion of the volcano erupting. And there's this lake at the foot of the mountain, and it was covered in floating logs from the trees that have been knocked down the mountainside. And when you look at pictures of what it looked like right after the volcano erupted, it's hard to imagine how anything could live there again. Everything was barren, and the land was burned, and all hope seemed to have disappeared. There was nothing left but dirt and ash. I went back to Mount St. Helens a few years ago with Melissa, and the area surrounding the mountain is filled with new trees and flowers and life. From the barren landscape, life has broken through. For years, you would never have known that there would be life there again. But working just under the surface in the dirt, new life was forming. And that new life broke through and filled the valley. Where there once was only death, there was new life growing. And the Garden of Gethsemane is not the final garden in the story. We find ourselves in the midst of the next one only a few short days later at a tomb in a garden. We find ourselves with Mary Magdalene in awe of the resurrection of Jesus. The cross and the empty tomb, Good Friday and Easter Sunday together tell the story of our hope. It is the story of life emerging from a place where all hope seemed to be lost. And that life overcoming the divide of death that our sin had created. But we shouldn't get too ahead of ourselves and skip ahead to that part that we like that Sunday morning. If we allow ourselves to live within this moment of the story, this Good Friday moment, we're at a point where we're standing, looking at the dirt, wondering if anything is happening down below. We can take a moment to think about what we each cost and who paid that price for us. And then we can learn to hope in places where there seems to be none. We watched as the plant died, and the seed was planted in the dirt, but now we have to wait. That seed of our hope and redemption has been planted, but we can't quite make out what's happening. We just have to wait a few days, and then we'll see clearly what's been growing.